But let's go ahead and get started. And I wanted to let everybody know that we're recording this. So if you are not comfortable being on the recording, feel free to turn off your video. And if you want to just put questions in the chat rather than speaking them, that's fine too, once we get to Q&A. So welcome everyone. This is our second event in our series of webinars on Puget Sound Energy. This is financial flaws, and there are quite a lot of them to cover. And we've had one so far on deception. The recording of that is available. The notes that you'll get from this will have the recordings to all of them. So I'd encourage you to look at that if you didn't get a chance to, and also to let you know that there are 3 more coming up in the series. So each one of those will be at the same time on Thursday. My name is Neil Anderson. I use he and him pronouns. And I want to acknowledge that I am on stolen land. I'm in Issaquah, which is the land of the Duwamish people. A lot of people here are probably from Seattle, which is stolen Duwamish land as well. And so I want to acknowledge that they were here for thousands of years before we were, and they were stewarding the land in responsible ways. We have really gone away from that. And it's important, I think, for us to recognize the way that they were caring for the land, to listen to those teachings and try to modify our behavior so that we're not destroying the land at the rate that we are right now. And something else I would suggest, if you do occupy Duwamish land, there is a program through which you can pay rent to the Duwamish people, because they're not even recognized as federally as a legal tribe. And so they're not getting the same federal funding. And so if you're occupying their land, then it makes sense to try to cover that somewhat. So someone will probably post that into the chat, but there is a link that you can go to for more information on that. And I also want to thank our co-hosts in this. We have quite a number of organizations that have been helping us put these together. So here's the list. And I also want to specifically thank the presenters that we're going to have tonight. So we've got Hillary Hayden, who is the director of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition. She has a master's degree in community development, and she's considering running for commissioner of the East King County Public Utility District, which is a proposed new district. So she's going to have a lot of great information about the way that utilities that are not for profit are run, since they are running for the community's interest rather than for the profit of external shareholders. And also I want to introduce Stacy Oakes, who is an organizer with 350 Seattle. Since 2017, she's been involved in helping protect our communities from the fracked gas facility that Puget Sound Energy is currently building on the ancestral tide flats of the Puyallup tribe. This is referred to as Tacoma LNG. And I was just reading that description, and it says involved in, but really she's been an amazing leader in that fight. And so let me turn it over and have Stacy start this out by talking about what it is that PSC actually does spend money on.
Great, thanks, Neil. And so as we go through today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what PSC is spending their money on and why it's expensive for us now. And then a little bit later, Neil's going to help share some of the things that will make PSC more expensive and their business practices more expensive in the future. And so looking at this, we can see there's a lot of things on here. Now, of course, there are other things that aren't on this list that Puget Sound Energy spends money on, but these are a few that maybe you might be surprised about. You might notice that pretty much none of these things on here are things that all of you came up with as things that we think a utility should be spending money on. Like really large executive salaries, for instance. I'll come right back to that in a moment, but if anybody wants to make some guesses in the chat at what PSE's top executive was compensated in 2019, feel free to throw that in the chat. It'll be fun to see what everybody kind of thinks for that. And while you guys are doing that, we'll just kind of talk a little bit about some of the other things. We're going to dig in a minute to rate increases for unnecessary and outdated infrastructure. We're going to talk about lobbying and campaign contributions. We're going to talk about advertising campaigns, and also something else that they spend their money on sometimes is actually legal teams to sue communities or local governments that resist their projects. So a lot of things that maybe we don't want our money going to fund. If we can go to the next slide, please, Neil. And if you were curious how much PSE's top executive makes in 2019, that would be 11 million. So let's see, we had 1 million plus big bonuses, 25 million was a good guess, 3 million. So definitely a lot of money. And again, remember, that is one executive making that amount, which is kind of mind-blowing, right? that job could be so demanding to need public dollars to go to that, especially at a time like this, where we have people in the winter in a pandemic who are, fighting to make sure that their electric isn't getting shut off. So keeping that in perspective is really important. And so one of the ways we're going to talk about in here is meddling in politics, buying favorable regulations, and quashing public dissent. So as you can see, Puget Sound Energy spends a lot of money on lobbying and campaign contributions. So one of the stats we have here is from 2019, and Puget Sound Energy spent over $854,000 on lobbying just for Washington State legislature race, legislature stuff, and on the governor. So that doesn't count local efforts for cities and counties. It doesn't count lobbying that may have been done at our Utilities and Transportation Commission, where some of their rates are determined. So in reality, that lobbying figure is potentially much bigger than that. Talking about campaign contributions, they're also spending a large amount there. For a recent 10-year period, Puget Sound Energy gave over $665,000 in campaign contributions to candidates just across Washington. And you're talking about candidates all over the political spectrum, from small local races all the way up to governor. And you're gonna kind of see that kind of blanket approach where they kind of want to have a little in with everybody. And maybe you're not sure, what a normal amount of lobbying or campaign contributions might be. To put that in perspective on both of these issues, Puget Sound Energy was outspending Amazon in both of these categories here in Washington. So that just gives a little bit of an idea. Last year in 2020, Puget Sound Energy had 10 lobbyists working just in Washington state, making anywhere from, $8,500 a month or so per lobbyist. So definitely a lot of money going to that if we were spending that wisely, might be able to go to better things, like the type of things that you guys were all putting in the chat earlier. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And so as we keep talking about meddling in politics and how does that show up? What does that get them by doing that? So we can see the giant amount that they're spending, but what does that get for them? So the ways we're going to see this show up locally is that we're going to see massive spending against local public utility district initiatives. So if a county decides, you know what, we'd rather do our own electric power, we want to make a public utility, Puget Sound Energy has in the past dumped enormous amounts of money for the type of races that they are into those areas in order to try and kind of squash that branching out and squash that energy independence from happening. And you're also going to see how that kind of turns out in disinformation and fear-based ads that could be connected to those local PUD efforts, or their local efforts to try and start having more energy efficient buildings and potentially getting gas out of new buildings, knowing that it's kind of on its way out. And those advertising campaigns a lot of times play on people's fear and say, this is going to make your energy rates go up. And it's also going to give them influence over state regulations and initiatives. So, as they put all this money into lobbying and they put all this money into campaign contributions, they are directly getting things that are going to be favorable to them doing business this way out of it. And we're going to dig into that as we keep going. Like I said, sometimes they're doing lawsuits against peoples and agencies that resist. The Tacoma LNG facility, we'll talk a little bit more as we keep going on too, but in that particular instance, one of the local residents was worried that the safety studies didn't seem very realistic, that Puget Sound Energy was saying there's no way a blast at this giant 8 million gallon tank could leave the property line. And so in order to try to see that, they did a public disclosure request, and lo and behold, the next day there was a lawsuit kind of trying to bar that person from getting that information. And we'll kind of see things like that repeated when there is local resistance. Another thing is going to be like really subtle local lobbying, and that could be through direct efforts, chambers of commerce, local campaign donations. And again, a lot of that stuff isn't even counted in these bigger figures that we're able to find. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And so buying favorable regulations and incentives. This is kind of one of those things where what did they get out of it? So things that we're going to see tangibly that give them more money is they're going to be potentially getting tax credits for gas upgrades to your home. When you do your taxes this year, if you look into it, you'll see that even though, again, gas infrastructure in homes is on its way out, they're still kind of offering you tax credits if you do some upgrades to your house, including upgrades to switch out to gas infrastructure. And you're going to see that lobbying to change and reduce fines for non-compliance. And some examples of that would be kind of what happened around the Clean Energy Transformation Act. Again, also the Tacoma LNG facility, there was construction going on for 2 years where it wasn't permitted, yet, that wasn't, there wasn't kind of a stop put to the activity, and a fine is only a possibility. And we're also going to be able to see that we're going to have an industry rigged permitting process. And again, kind of going into that Tacoma LNG example, this facility, if people have heard about it before, has been controversial from the start. It lacks proper health, safety, and environmental analysis. It also lacks the legally mandated consultation with the Puyallup tribe. There was documented obstruction of public participation. Like I said, construction happening for 2 years before it was actually permitted. To put a point of how widespread the opposition is to the way that this has been going on, is that even Attorney General Bob Ferguson's recently added his voice to the upcoming legal appeal with the Puyallup tribe and Earth Justice, saying that permit needs to be revoked. Another way that we're going to end up really kind of paying for stuff ourselves as residents for things that really Puget Sound Energy should be doing is we're going to see things like upgrades to roads for heavy transport, operating additional safety services like fire stations, corporate tax breaks. So those are all things that we end up paying for, even though it's things that they need to run this big infrastructure that they decide they want to put in. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And so Energize Eastside is another current example that I want to just dig into. So one of the things that they're able to do is that they can increase the rates to residential gas and electric customers when they build infrastructure. Now, there's unfortunately no mandate that says this infrastructure that we have to pay them back for has to be the best long-term investment. There's no mandate that it has to, comply with social justice, and there's no mandate that it has to comply with where Washington State wants its climate goals to be. So we're potentially stuck paying for things that really run against our own best interests. Energize Eastside is a transmission rebuild that would run between kind of the Kirkland-Redmond area and down all the way to Renton. And as you can see with the picture there, Energized Eastside is going to actually destroy thousands of trees that we know we need for our air quality and for habitat. And along with that, it would also create some industrial impacts for dozens of residential neighborhoods. So looking at that, you might think, why would we have to pay them back for that? And what happens is that Puget Sound Energy will build these projects, and then they can go to our Utilities and Transportation Commission, the way that our system is currently set up, and say, we spent all this money. Can you make people reimburse through rate increases on their gas and electric rates? And so far, they usually get what they ask for, which is something that we need to start kind of taking our power back on. We're going to have a take action step that'll help us out with that later when we get towards the end of the presentation. But they're going to be able to do these things even if it's not, again, kind of in everybody's best interest. Let's hop over to the next slide. So one of the ways that they kind of get the Utilities and Transportation Commission to okay these things is that they inflate the demand. So we're kind of playing around with numbers in order to get a yes. So this particular project is designed to counter a rare, never before experienced power outage that we may or may never have. And the forecasts that they used in order to determine that are at least 6 years out of date. So we're going to see kind of cherry picking of data that kind of finds the outcomes that they want. Another issue with this financially is that these costs are really unfair from a customer standpoint. This is supposed to serve 2 million of their customers are actually going to get charged monthly for decades in order to pay for this project. So that's talking about diverting over $1 billion that could be going to tackle reliability, environmental, and equity issues. But instead, we're kind of dumping it into something that really is outdated infrastructure that we don't really need. But the way that Puget Sound Energy, the way that our utilities and infrastructure right now is set up is that Puget Sound Energy benefits more when they build stuff. That's where they get a rate of return. And so the bigger the stuff they build, the more money that goes back to their shareholders. And so that's what drives them to build this stuff, not that they think it's actually a good investment. Just a quick little idea of like, what could we do with that $1 billion for about half that price? One thing that's been done in other places is that radio receivers could be put on people's water heaters. And that would allow PSE to turn those water heaters off for a few hours here and there when there's those peak loads. And that would actually keep us from having to kind of get to those thresholds where we might need a little bit of extra power. And for most people, they probably wouldn't even kind of notice this with the way that water heaters are designed. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide and let's take a look at another example. So this next example is the Tacoma Liquefied Natural Gas Facility, the Tacoma LNG. And the main purpose for this facility that's going to consist of an 8 million gallon storage tank and some other processing equipment on site. The majority of this facility is actually designed to be for marine bunkering, which is basically fuel for maritime ships. So these are going to be customers other than you and I, other than residential customers, and they'll be reselling that gas for a profit. So that's what the majority of the facility is going to be used for. Yet they've gone to the Utilities and Transportation Commission and tried to secure that if this project gets okay, that we as customers are going to pay for about 43% of the construction costs of this project. Which, when you compare that to how much we as residential customers will use this facility, it's pretty startling that our government agencies would allow this kind of cost to be passed on to us. So you'll see on the image on the left by the Sightline Institute that it shows about 7% of this facility's gas would go to utility customers, and that's what's called peak shaving. where when it's the coldest days of the year for a few hours a day, it would kick in when we have that highest peak demand for the year. But we recently found out after that graphic was made that they only intend to use this facility for residential use for the first 10 years of a much longer lease, bringing it down to about 2% of the use by customers over the life cycle of this facility. So we're seeing some similarities to Energize Eastside. We're seeing some kind of some tactics getting reused here, which is that we're overinflating the demand. We're going to see that there's kind of an unequal distribution of who's paying for things. And let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and we'll check out maybe a few more similarities to this project and Energize Eastside like we just talked about. In this case, if Puget Sound Energy hadn't inflated the demand forecast to say that we might need that peak shaving on those few days and included that little sliver for us customers, they wouldn't have been able to go to the Utilities and Transportation Commission and ask for us to pay for that huge chunk of the project. So by inflating the demand, by potentially lobbying their way into these kind of lax rules, we're stuck on the hook for that facility's cost. And it would potentially be really surprising to know, because most things don't have a guaranteed return of 10%, but Puget Sound Energy shareholders are guaranteed a return of 10% on their infrastructure. Going back to, like I said, build it bigger and you get more back. And you know, that really doesn't matter whether, again, it's safe, whether it's smart in the long term, or what the other social costs included are. And another place that they kind of exaggerate and play with numbers in order to get these things built is even looking at the greenhouse gas benefits and seeing some play with that. Liquefied natural gas is not a climate solution for shipping. And there's been a lot of kind of back and forth. There's a lot of misinformation that's been said about gas in general, about liquefied natural gas. But even the International Maritime Organization, again, 75% of this gas would be for marine vessels. In 2018, the International Maritime Organization did their own study, and they said, quote, LNG is not a climate solution for shipping. So we know that the justification for building the project isn't real. And in order to get their permits approved, they were using calculations based on outdated and misleading data, methane values from 2006. To put that in perspective for folks, if you can remember back to 2006, a lot of us were going to Blockbuster to watch movies. We had flip phones, and I think that was the year that the first iPad was coming out. So there's a lot that's changed since then, and so to use the scientific data about methane from then is pretty terrible when we look at what the stakes are for not adequately addressing climate as quickly as possible. Also, just to kind of note on here, not a financial cost, but again, as we think that we are in this kind of ransom with our money and having to pay for these facilities, should customers be forced to pay rate increases for infrastructure that violate treaties? What about for infrastructure that emits toxin carcinogens in our own neighborhoods potentially? Should we have to pay for that? What about, you know, having to pay for more fracking infrastructure, knowing the consequences to water supplies, habitat, community health, and climate? And so just starting to kind of think through what taking our power back would mean, that it also helps us not be complicit in some of these harms. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. One other kind of promise area that doesn't seem to pan out is the good old promise of jobs, jobs, jobs. And this is another piece of kind of information or talking points that get used a lot when a project is first coming out to a community, and they talk about all the hundreds of jobs that'll be created. But most of those jobs are temporary construction jobs. And in the Tacoma LNG facility's case, as one of our current examples, there's only going to be 19 permanent jobs. and that's on over 30 acres of land. So, I mean, what else could we be doing on that space that would actually create a large number of living wage jobs for the local community? You know, the community gets this promise of jobs, and especially like in Tacoma's case, we're seeing a huge rise in homelessness. We're seeing an increase in food insecurity, and people stuck working multiple low-wage jobs. So this promise of jobs that doesn't pan out, there are real consequences to that for people. And I think that another thing that this does, by pushing the jobs angle as they're trying to get these facilities okayed, even though they know that it's very low permanent jobs, is that it helps to kind of put labor and climate at odds with each other, and to push on that really fake narrative of that, when we know that there are plenty of things that need to be built and use use construction and skilled labor in order to get more affordable housing, in order to fix our water infrastructure and our transportation infrastructure. And so there's plenty of things that we could be spending our money on that address good jobs, climate, and aren't contributing to what's already a really unhealthy air quality, especially in Tacoma's case. I believe it's the second worst air quality already in the region, and this facility hasn't even started to emit its toxins 24 hours a day yet. So those are just some of the costs that we're seeing right off the bat. These are things that Puget Sound Energy is spending their money on today. But we know that these decisions are actually going to have even more financial impacts down the road. So I'm going to turn it back over to Neil, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about costs that we could see kind of coming our way in the future because of these business practices.
Thanks, Stacy. So Stacy has covered what they're spending money on now and how they're misspending money. I want to talk a little bit about what kind of costs can be incurred in the future as a result of these decisions. And let me start with jobs, since we had ended on that. And I think that's a really important one because that's the argument that's always used for these projects. That's the reason that we couldn't kill Keystone XL. That's the reason that we can't shut down any of these refineries, is because they're jobs. And it's a ridiculous argument because any activity creates jobs. You can justify literally anything by saying, this will give a person a job. And actually, I take something that Stacy had said from an earlier presentation that I thought was a really good way of putting this. The tank is already built. And so if this were denied and it had to be taken back down, that creates a lot more jobs than the permanent jobs that we're going to get. So the best thing we could do from a job standpoint is to deny this and put people to work taking it apart. And the other thing about jobs, she mentioned that there are going to be 19 jobs on 32 acres. And so that's a good way of looking at how effective this is as a job creator, but it's also a $300 million project. And if you spend $300 million on 32 acres, if you're given that amount of money and that amount of land and somebody tells you, create something that's going to create jobs, and you can only come up with 19 jobs with that much money and that much land, then you have completely failed if your effort is to put people to work. And the reason is that fossil fuels are not an area where investments lead to large numbers of jobs, because we've been extracting fossil fuels out of the ground for over 100 years. It's all automated now. So by building these projects, you're not putting people to work, you're putting machines to work. Whereas things like renewables, solar and wind, that hasn't been automated to that extent. If you're putting solar panels on people's houses, a person has to be doing that. A machine's not doing it. Fastest growing sectors right now are wind turbine technician and solar panel installers. So really from a jobs standpoint, that points you to renewables as being the best thing that you can do. And okay, so we've got stranded infrastructure assets. Stranded assets are when you've invested in something and you end up having to abandon it earlier than you expected. So for example, with the LNG tank, there probably expecting that to last 30 years or so. That's how long infrastructure projects are generally forecast to last, 30 to 40 years. But the world is really turning against gas pretty recently. There was sort of an expectation that we'd still be building up gas maybe for decades, if not longer. But just recently, a lot of cities are starting to ban gas hookups. We're starting to see a lot of motion in this area against gas. And so it's very likely that all of this spending that they're doing on building up new gas projects are not going to be used as long as they expect, and they're not going to recoup the money that they put into it. And so it's ratepayers that are on the hook for that. If they abandon LNG and have to invest in something else, then we have bought both of them. So stranded assets is a very real possibility with these, and it's not something that affects their thinking because they profit on what they build today, whereas the people who are on the hook for the charges resulting from stranded assets, that's us. And then other costs, you've got taxpayer burdens for any kind of incident at the plant. And the reason is that they're not really insured for this. They created a shell company called, I think it's Puget LNG. And it doesn't even have any employees. It's basically an accounting trick to get them out of the liability. And it's got $50 million coverage. The tank itself is $300 million. So if there were some serious incident like an earthquake that ruptures the tank and there's a catastrophic explosion, then that's going to be way more than just the cost of the tank. It's going to be that $300 million plus all of the costs of the damage inflicted on the community. PSE is not going to pay for any of that. That is all going to be on the taxpayers. And then, of course, because this is a fossil fuel project, this is driving climate change. And there are tons of costs associated with climate change already, and they're mounting faster and faster. Right now, we're already seeing medical costs increasing for things like asthma, cancer. Anybody who is near one of these refineries or near a fracking extraction site. But as the climate crisis intensifies, those damages are going to increase. We're going to be paying more and more because of these short-sighted decisions. And then the last one, I think, is an important point that often gets overlooked. It's the opportunity cost of this money. This is $300 million coming from the energy sector that was spent on something that is not helping us usher in the clean energy future. All energy spending needs to be on renewables right now. If we have any hope of getting down to zero emissions within 30 years, which the UN has said we have to do, then we can't be spending money on these lateral moves of switching out one fossil fuel for another. We have to be putting all of our money towards renewables, and this is a $300 million investment that does not move us towards that. So just a little bit more specifics on some of these points. Stranded assets, we already talked about, and it is definitely a foolish decision, knowing that these things are likely not to operate throughout their projected lifespan. But also, even with LNG for shipping, that's something that the fossil fuel industry would have assumed was safe, because that's one of the sectors that's considered very hard to decarbonize. And so a lot of people thought, yeah, for the next 30 years, we don't really have any choice for things like shipping. But even the International Maritime Organization recently has looked into this and said, you know, that's not even true for shipping. There are solutions that are on the horizon. There's hydrogen, there's ammonia. There are a lot of things that you can use that are not polluting, depending on how you source them. And so for PSE to try to justify this and saying, we're doing this because we're helping clean up the shipping industry doesn't agree with that. And then we talked about this. This is the limited liability company, the shell company that they created. And I think one of the interesting things about this is not only can they get out of paying for it and we have to pay for it, but also that doesn't give them the incentive to build safely, because they're not on the hook if there is a catastrophic accident. They get their $50 million insurance, they cover what they can, and then they walk away from it. And if they were actually responsible for the costs, then I'm pretty sure that they'd be building more carefully than they are. And then in terms of this is the divestment movement is picking up steam as well. This is divesting away from fossil fuels in general. And we talked about specifically how it applies to gas. We're seeing more gas bans. This article is when the mayor proposed one for Seattle. That was actually unanimously adopted by the city council just 2 days ago. So we're seeing a ton of movement towards getting rid of gas in places where people thought it was decades away before that started happening. And that brings, this only started in June of 2019, was the first city to ban gas. There are already over a dozen cities that have done that. So really picking up steam, and very unlikely that we'll still be using gas to the extent that PSE is forecasting in 30 years. And yeah, definitely a bad bet for investors. The one I find interesting here is the third one: solar power is cheap. Why aren't we using it more? And I like the subtext of that is inertia that's in the energy system. And I think that's what a lot of it is. Solar power has gotten dramatically cheaper. It's 10 years ago, it wasn't competitive. Now it's cheaper than fossil fuels. Same thing with wind. They have really come down, and we haven't seen the shift in the energy mix yet. Especially from companies that are run for profit like PSE. But I think the reason for that is because they're familiar with fossil fuels. That's what their systems are designed to use. That's how they know they can meet the demand, because they've got experience with that. So I think what we really need to do is push them outside of their comfort zone and start using renewable fuels that maybe they don't have the experience with. Because from a financial standpoint, there's no reason not to be moving to renewables as fast as possible. And then this lists out some of the direct financial costs from climate change, and it's really unfortunate that we have to think about it in financial terms, but you can put a price tag on it. And yeah, it turns out that it's extremely expensive, even right now, in terms of the damages that people are experiencing, especially around fracking sites. And what we're finding more and more is gas stoves. That was relatively unknown until a few years ago, but a lot of studies have started showing dramatically increased asthma rates for kids who are in homes with gas stoves. So yeah, we've got long-term climate impacts, but we've also got near-term environmental impacts from continued fossil fuel combustion. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about was carbon pricing. That's another reason that the way that they make financial decisions is extremely flawed. They're looking at, when they're doing the accounting, it's free to pollute. There is no charge for putting carbon in the atmosphere. And so that skews their calculations by itself. And there's really no reason to do that, because yeah, that's true now. It's not going to stay true. It's very likely that at some point we'll get a federal price on carbon. And at least within Washington, there's already cap and trade language in the climate plan that the governor just came out with a few months ago. And cap and trade is another form of carbon pricing, but it would drive up the cost of fossil fuels. So they're making financial decisions based on the current cost and the expectation that they can pollute for free. And that's not going to be the case, which means the accounting is going to change, and decisions that might have looked to them to be good decisions now are going to be more costly later. And so one way to remedy that is to use something called a social cost of carbon. And that's a smart thing to do anyway, just to factor in the possibility of getting a carbon price. But it's also a way to build those climate impacts and the environmental impacts into the calculations. So if you're looking at it from just a financial standpoint, this is a way to account for that. And so this is something that we've been pushing PSE to include. I believe they do include it on some of the models, but they don't necessarily use those models to make the decisions. So there's been some movement towards that, but obviously the price their point that they want to use is much lower than what it actually should be to account for the real damages. So it is important that we continue to push on PSE to use the social cost of carbon in all of their modeling and to use a reasonable price in doing that as well. And there will be information later on how to take action. And one of the things you can do is help to pressure them on that. So now let me turn it over to Hillary to talk about PUDs.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Neil and Stacy, for getting someone from the Public Utility District campaign to present tonight. Like Neil said earlier, I'm Hillary Hayden. I work on international trade policy in my day job, but I do live in the proposed East King County Public Utility District, and I'm exploring a run for commissioner for one of the sections of the PUD. And I get the joy of talking folks through what an alternative to this bad investment that PSE is, what that alternative might look like. I'm going to have you switch to the next slide, if you could. So you see a public utility district invoice in front of you. And you can see right away the number of charges that we've managed to get rid of between the last invoice and the one that you're looking at right now. Now we know that a lot of us care about making sure that we have reliable power. And we know that a lot of us care about making investments in good renewable infrastructure. But I didn't hear anyone say, it's really, really important to me that my electricity company lobbies for favorable regulations or gives big campaign contributions to people who are going to give them favorable regulations in the first place. And so I think it's important to note that as we look at what costs we might be responsible for. Next slide, please. Awesome. So what is a public utility? They're consumer-owned, not-for-profit utilities focused on customer satisfaction and directed by residents of the utility service area. And this is not a new idea. These have been in existence in the state for decades, and a lot of the longest existing PUDs are actually in Eastern Washington and more rural parts of the state. I wanted to note that this some of the PUDs in this map only do water, and we recently found out that you could possibly do internet through a public utility district, and we actually haven't cross any of those options off the list at this point in time for what the East King County Public Utility District might look like. But we know that at the point that there would be one established, we would have access to the Bonneville Power Administration, like cheaper, but also very clean electricity that PSE actually doesn't have access to at this point in time. Next slide, please. Awesome. So how would this look different from having PSE in charge of our power? We know that investor-owned utilities are run by their investors and executives rather than run by elected commissioners that are accountable to the public. We know that investor-owned utilities are privately owned, they're secretive versus having a lot of transparency with the public over where they're getting their power. We know that investor-owned utilities are for profit, that their direct incentive is to make money for the company, but also to return money to their shareholders, versus having a public utility that's not for profit, and their incentive is to make sure that people in their district are happy, that they have reliable power and access to whatever goods the utility district is supplying. And then we also know that investor-owned utilities in Washington state, at least, are roughly 10% more expensive than having a public utility district. We can't say for sure what the exact difference will be for the East King County Public Utility District. That will look that information will come out as we figure out what this is going to look like. But we are pretty sure that it will be more affordable in the long run. Next slide. Awesome. So on the left here, you see a 2019 fuel mix from PSE. And so you see a pretty big portion of it is hydro and a chunk is wind. And then you see really big chunks that are coal and natural gas and things we're not so excited about. On the right-hand side, you see a 2017 fuel mix. I'm sorry, my dog is joining us. This is the joy of working from home. The second graph is a fuel mix for all of the Washington PUD. So you see hydro takes up such a much bigger chunk of that graph versus natural gas versus nuclear and coal and other things that we're not as excited about. And this it's interesting to know that this doesn't include data from municipal utilities, which would shift that fuel mix even cleaner than it is in this graph. So I hope that many of you are asking, wow, we would love for Eastgate County to have a public utility district. What can I do to help? Would you please switch me to the next slide? I'm glad you asked. Anyone that lives in Washington can do a handful of things for us. We're looking for people to help with fundraising. We're looking for people that might help us develop materials or walk doors at some point. That's not an immediate need. Working on political strategy and helping us broaden the coalition of folks that might support this. Now, people who live in the public utility district, we are definitely looking for people that can connect with decision makers and business owners. We're also looking for people just to reach out to friends, family, acquaintances, people that you know and say, hey, this is a good idea and here's why. We will be collecting signatures online in 2022. So I know there will be a signature drive at that point in time. And also if you are interested in getting involved, you can go ahead and email info@ekc-pud.org. We'd love to have you involved in the organizing. And with that, I will hand it off to Neil, but I'm happy to take questions as they come up at the end. Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you, Hillary. And thanks for running for commissioner of that. We need people stepping up and trying to push towards more community ownership of these things. So here are a list of ways that we can start taking our power back. One is the public hearing on PSE's 20-year plan. Every couple of years they come out with one of these. This is their forecast for how they're going to spend money. It just came out recently and still very gas heavy. In fact, the way they're forecasting it is that gas usage will roughly stay the same for the next 20 years, which is ridiculous. It needs to be phased out as fast as possible, and they are not on that page yet. So there is a public comment period where people can voice their opinions. So I encourage people to show up for that. They accept written testimony as well. And then there is something coming up, which I think is really important, which is a new method of accounting for how these, how the climate impacts of these fossil fuel projects are assessed. And what we've seen in the past is every time there's a proposal, they use ridiculous numbers for the climate impact. And we have to go to hearings and we have to submit statements and we have to provide expert testimony showing how these are invalid numbers. And it eventually works. We usually are able to kill off the projects by finally getting them to acknowledge the real climate impacts. But it's a huge waste of time to have to do that. And we need to be directing our money towards building a clean future now. We can't keep fighting off of these projects. So this is an effort by the Department of Ecology to standardize these rules so that it doesn't end up in these long and costly back and forth negotiations for what that impact should be. And it's extremely important because if the fossil fuel industry were to write these rules, it would take away our ability to argue against them, which we've been very successful at. But if we have input into the rules and we have them use the most current science and a reasonable leak rate, which is something they really tried to undercount, then that will show the true climate impact, and these new fossil fuel projects won't be able to be proposed at all, which means we can start concentrating on dismantling the existing gas infrastructure and building up renewables. So this sounds like kind of a wonky bureaucratic thing, but it's extremely important, and there's a large campaign that's forming around this. So this is something you'll be hearing more about, and there's a series of webinars that you can watch on this as well. And then PUD efforts, Hillary told you how important PUDs are. They really are much, much cleaner because they're making decisions based on community interest. They're run by people who live in the community, which is not true for companies like PSE. So definitely do anything you can to support that. Healthy Homes, Clean Buildings legislation, that is a bill that would, I said that within Seattle, we're talking about disallowing new gas hookups. This is statewide legislation that would do that for all of Washington. And it wouldn't take effect until 2030, which is, we need to accelerate that, but it would at least define that as the endpoint for there will be no more gas in new buildings after this. So that's an important thing to support and to strengthen. And then a bill about utilities reform. I actually don't know much about that one. I don't know if one of our other presenters can say anything about that. Okay, well, information on that will be in the notes that go out. And that will also have a link to how to participate in the IRP and where to go for the webinars on the greenhouse gas rule. So that ends the presentation. I want to open it up for Q&A now. So we've got a lot of people. I guess we can try to have people come off mute and ask a question, or if people would rather type into the chat, we'll just see how that goes. And I did want to remind people that this is being recorded, so if you're not comfortable with your image being in the recording, you can turn off your video before asking a question.
And maybe folks could just use the raise hand function, so we don't have people popping off mute in the middle of other folks asking questions. So if you're excited to ask a question, there are buttons on your screen there to where if you go to participants, I believe, you can hit kind of a raise hand function, and we'll keep an eye out to call out for your questions. See if we have any yet. I think most of our questions that were typed in the chat, we had a lot of people answering those questions in the chat. Let's see. Oh, we got a new one here. So are there efforts to give them greater authority? I think we mean the Utilities and Transportation Commission. Are there efforts to give greater authority via legislation or administrative aims? Is there somebody that wanted to field that? I know we have some folks on the call that work really closely with some of the integrated resource planning. I know Don Marsh is on here. If you have a good answer, I can take you off mute.
Yeah, hi. It would be great if we could get some legislation that would give the UTC a little bit more teeth. I don't know of legislation right now that is aimed to do that, but the UTC, they have sort of a conflict where they're supposed to represent us, the customers, so that we're not taken advantage of by a monopoly, basically. But they are also responsible for making sure that PSE gets enough money to run their utility. So they sort of have to look at both sides of the fence. And we found that there were certain instances where we thought we had reasonable requests for the UTC. Like we wanted PSE to give us a little bit of data about transmission line that they were planning. This isn't Energize East Side, it was a different one. And we actually filed a formal complaint saying, we need to see what PSE's case is for this transmission line. And we wanted to do a study ourselves to show that there were better options. And the UTC said, we will do it if you can show us the Washington Administrative Code that gives us the authority to make PSE release information that they don't want to. And so we said, okay, we will find that code and get back to you. We couldn't find anything in the Washington Administrative Code that gave the commission the authority to compel PSE to answer our request. So we had to drop our complaint because it just wasn't legally supported. That's a really big problem. And that's why I think a PUD is a completely different story, because the commissioners there serve the people directly. And if you need some information, you can make a public records request, and they are bound by law to answer that. PSC is not bound. There is no public disclosure mechanism that applies to a privately owned company. So PUD is probably the ultimate answer. The other way is to get the UTC to be stronger, but I think that's a long road, and I'm not too optimistic about it.
And in a related question, somebody asked, how are these Utilities and Transportation Commission, how are they chosen? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they are appointed by Governor Inslee. Is that correct?
That is correct. It's a little bit interesting how it works, because to preserve a little bipartisanship there, the governor is required to appoint one commissioner of the opposite party. So if you look at a lot of major commission rulings, you see a lot of like 2-to-1 decisions. It's usually the odd vote is often the guy from the other party, but it's tough. It's just like we have a very strange system here where PSE gets to make its own decisions about what they want to build. And then almost every time after they're done building it, they go to the commission and say, we need to be compensated not only for what we spent, but then this 10% rate of return for every year that infrastructure is in service. And this is what blows my mind. When I think of 10% return, I think of, okay, if they spend $200 million or $300 million, then 10% of that is they get $3 million back. Okay, well, that's, that seems fair. That's $3 million every year that infrastructure is in service. So if you add that up, that's why these projects become immensely profitable. And that's why foreign investors are really happy to own a business that has that state-backed 10% annual return on investment. It is a sweet deal. There's a lot of investors here who would love to have a stable government-backed investment opportunity like that. And too bad, it's not for you. It's just for those foreign investors. So not good.
Thanks so much, Don. And I just want to uplift something that Martha said in the chat there, that by that term using the UTC being bipartisan, that again is another way that we're locked into a two-party fighting system versus how does that incorporate potential third parties. So just another good point to bring up there as far as how we can't just change part of a system, we have to change systems as a whole if we really want to get somewhere. We had another good question in the chat, and that was brought up around the fuels for shipping. And Megan, I see your hand raised. We'll come to your question next. So there was also a question about shipping fuels and whether, the big cargo ships and cruise ships. So potentially, if you're using those other dirtier fuels, isn't LNG or using gas better? And that's definitely the narrative that's been out for a long time, is that they are better. And that's the narrative that was used in order to try and get the Tacoma LNG facility permitted. However, again, going back to say that study, and I know the link to the actual study itself was dropped in the chat, and it's just an easy 5-page read if anybody wants to peek through it. But the evidence that they point to in this study is really clear. In fact, the main point on the front page says, quote, LNG is not a climate solution for shipping. And so where you're going to get there is some more misinformation, which we covered a lot about misinformation in our first series that it's recorded in the resource doc. But liquefied natural gas, or natural gas in general, is going to be cleaner at point of burning. So is it better for the lungs of those workers right there? Absolutely. However, when you look at the life cycle of the gas, where did the gas come from? How much leaked during fracking? How much leaked during transmission? How much leaked during storage? When you look at that and you add that up against those other bunker fuels, when you add that up against coal for powering buildings and things, you're going to find that liquefied natural gas, or just natural gas in general, is as bad or worse for the climate than those other fuels. It's only better when you look at it in this small, narrow window of, at this one moment in time of its life, is it better? And in that moment it is. But when we talk about worker health, is it fair to say we trade out these workers on the ship's air for these people that live near the fracking communities, for these people that live near the facilities like the Tacoma liquefied natural gas storage? That facility will emit carcinogens and toxins 24 hours a day. So we're just trading who has to deal with those negative impacts. It's not actually better. And so there's been numerous studies that have been coming out over the last couple years, where now that we really understand better the impacts of methane on climate, that we know that those old kind of lies that this fossil fuel is better than those other ones, it's just not. And to invest in these technologies versus, okay, we'll keep using this that's already built for a minute while we get into really renewables, to build new infrastructure is just absolute madness. Megan, let me get you unmuted here.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. This may be beyond the scope because, this discussion is honing in rightfully on the LNG. So if it doesn't fit, or if it might fit in a future presentation, that would be fine. But there was a reference made earlier to cap and trade. And I've always looked at that as a smoke and mirrors thing, as opposed to actually saying, let's just bring down the emissions here and now. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I actually meant to mention that when I was on that slide. Yeah, we're not in favor of cap and trade. A lot of studies have looked at that. It does allow the industry to play shell games. And when it's been put into practice, it hasn't worked. So yeah, that was not advocating for that, but it was saying that because that language is there, it is likely that the price of fossil fuels will be driven up as a result. It's not the right way to do it because it will have negative impacts on communities as well. But it is going to drive up the cost, and is something that PSE is not taking into account.
And we did have a correction that happened in the chat that on the UTC, the people elected, that the language does actually allow that there just needs to be kind of someone of an opposite party as that kind of third person. So there was actually some language kind of addressing being able to make a third party person eligible for that. So thank you for pointing that out to Jim. And let's see, we had another question from Bradley, and it's he says he's surprised that PSE isn't even more expensive than other public utilities, and is that because they exploit more or take more tax dollars? And I think one part of the way to answer that too is that we looked at some of those things that they pay for and some of the things that they don't, and so we know there's money going to a lot of things that we really have no reason to pay for, right? So we know they're spending on those, but there is a lot of stuff that they're not spending money on, and that is they're not trying to make us more energy efficient, because that doesn't make them money, right? If they make things more energy efficient, they're actually selling less power and they're making less money. And so you're going to see that kind of some of those in the long run things that Neil was talking about are really going to come back and bite us down the road too. So it looks like maybe Don wants to jump in on that. Go ahead, Don.
Yeah, I already said a little of this in the chat, but I think this is a really great example. So during our most recent windstorm, PSE lost a whole bunch of customers. I had the percentage, but now I've forgotten it. But it was substantial. Probably like 1 in 4 customers or something like that were without power. There's a cooperative utility that serves Gig Harbor, which also lost about the same number of customers. And so I was watching the statistics of both of these companies try to get their people back online. And within 24 hours, Peninsula Light had almost all of their customers back up and running. Whereas for PSE, it took 4 times longer. Some people were without power for even longer than 4 days to do the same thing. Now, there is a size difference between the two, but what's really a notable difference is that Peninsula Light, about a decade ago, was in the 4th quarter of reliability. That means that compared to their peers, they were doing really bad as far as the reliability of their power. So they undertook a program to every year look at what their worst serving distribution lines were, and they would systematically move those distribution lines underground. And so after they pursued that for about 6 years, now they were in the 1st quarter of reliability, which means that, the top quarter compared to their peers, while PSE has gone down and down, and now they're bouncing around about the 4th quartile of reliability. And PSE does not like to put things underground. So when we have a windstorm and trees knock down their power lines, it takes a long time to get them back. Peninsula Light, although they did have a lot of power outages, it was like transformers and things that could be relatively quickly reset. And that's why they were able to get their customers going again. So the long answer to the question, why are PSE's rates still somewhat reasonable? Well, if they're not spending the money to make our reliability better, that's a great way for them to economize. And we have to pay for that in the reliability of our power. So it's artificially cheap, the prices that we're paying, at least with regards to reliability.
Thanks, Don. And I'll just flag that we're getting closer to 7:15, which is when we hope to kind of close this out. So we'll probably just try and do maybe another question or two. And while folks are thinking of those last questions, I just want to take the time for just a second to point out that we talked about the Tacoma LNG facility quite a bit, and I know that a lot of people on here do really care about social justice, and I just wanted to remind folks that one of our other events in this series is going to be about Indigenous sovereignty and pipeline politics. So there's going to be a great opportunity 2 weeks from now to hear a little bit more about people along the pipeline route, and including to Puyallup tribal members, and see how PSE kind of interacts in those spaces. And along with that, the conversation, which is one of our co-hosts for tonight, they're also having a 2-hour event on Sunday, February 21st from 1 to 3 p.m. that has an amazing slate of speakers. And the conversation is a social justice organization down in Tacoma. And it looks like we got the info for that dropped in the chat. But that is going to be an amazing event. So I just wanted to plug, if anybody's interested in learning a little bit more about the aspect of how this is harming tribal members, that we have some great opportunities coming up. And let's see if we had any more questions dropped in the chat there. Yeah, please keep us posted for when we can make comments to the UTC. So the hearing date is set. We just don't have a link or a time for that hearing yet, but I believe it's February 26th, which is a Friday. And so if you could, basically all that info will appear in that resources doc that you will all get, that you all have the access to now. And in our follow-up email on Monday, we'll have that resources doc as well. And as we add more stuff, it automatically pops up into that doc for you. So, so we'll definitely make sure everybody gets the info on how to take part in that, and the new rules for fossil fuels that Neil talked about, which is potentially a huge game changer. And so we really appreciate everybody coming here to learn more and to be able to take action steps. Let's see. And if you didn't already register for the other ones in this series, again, it's you can register at our bit.ly that we'll drop in the chat. Let's see, Neil or Hillary, any other kind of last closing stuff that you'd want to add before we close out today?
Well, I'm happy to plug the PUD one more time and just say, if you're interested in volunteering, if you're interested in helping with outreach and building the coalition and political strategizing and all of the stuff that comes with getting a campaign off the ground, please, please, please send an email to that info@ekc-pud.org. We'd love to have you. Thanks so much.
And I just wanted to say that it was nice seeing that some of the last comments were questions about how people can take action and stay involved. It can seem daunting to try to change something as large as a utility company, or the way that fossil fuel projects are established. But when we're all working together, we really can make those changes. And so the resources document that will come out will have these links to ways that you can take action now and stay involved in the fight.
It looks like we did have one more quick question. PSE is required to spend a certain amount of money for energy saving programs. They do this, but I don't know how their percentage of their budget compares to that of, say, a PUD. Did either Hillary or Don or one of our other folks on have any insight into that particular piece of comparison?
I'm happy to defer to someone else to talk about explicit stuff that we know from other PUDs. I know a lot of stuff for the East King County one is really up in the air budgeting wise, and I think that's often how it is at the very beginning of a PUD campaign. But if Don or anyone else has anything to add, I'd be happy.
I don't know what the percentages are. I do know that PSE does some pretty interesting stuff in what they claim are effective energy efficiency programs. It gets pretty technical. So I'll just say that there's a lot of opportunities that PSE does not take advantage of, and really there could be a lot better programs than what we're getting out of PSE.
Wonderful. Well, maybe we'll go ahead and just stop it there. Hope to see all of you again next week. And really appreciate everybody's engagement and questions. And this has been a wonderful, wonderful event. And also a big thank you to Leslie for helping us today with tech. And yeah, we'll see all of you next week.